The title of my talk is not discovering hidden treasures in Reactatron. Those hidden treasures will remain hidden for the foreseeable future. Here's the reality. We were working on some cool stuff with Reactatron, and it wasn't ready. And besides, I really wanted to talk about this. So I changed the title of my talk. It was a little bit too late to get these reprinted, so sorry about that. But I hope it will be a good talk. I actually feel pretty good about where it is right now. So quickly, a little bit about me. I'm Jamon Holmgren. That is how you pronounce my name, Jamon. If you're from Spain, you can say Jamon. Otherwise say Jamon. Resolving the great state debate. So this is a little bit, don't ignore that. This is a little bit of an aspirational title. I really don't think I'm going to resolve anything on this stage right now. But I do want to present what we at Infinite Red ended up with. Actually, hold on a second here. Sorry about that. Aha, yes. I may not be able to use this because it is skipping too many slides. So I am the co-founder and CTO of Infinite Red. You can find me on Twitter at Jamon Holmgren. I tweet quite a bit, and so you may not want that noise, but I hope it's interesting. It's a lot of React Native. I live in the Pacific Northwest, near Portland, Oregon in the US, and with my wife, 4 kids. I work from home. I have a company, which I will talk about right now, Infinite Red. We're about 30 people, mostly in North America. We do mobile and web design, fully remote. We do React.js, but we're most known for our React Native work. And we are actually exploring into AI and machine learning. Gant Laborde, who has been to this conference before and given talks, is actually leading up our AI and machine learning efforts. We also put on another React Native conference. It's kind of the sister conference to this conference. And we both started the same year. It was really awesome to be able to compare notes, and we continue to do so. That's called Chain React, and it's held in Portland, Oregon. The next one's going to be July 2020. I hope you all can make it. It's a really fantastic conference that has a lot of similar content to what is talked about here, but sometimes a little different crowd, people on the west coast of the US. You can find more about that, infinite.red, Chain React Conf. I'm involved in the React Native open source core team. I was involved with the Lean Core initiative. Thibaut talked about WebView. I worked with Thibaut to extract that from the core React Native as basically the first module to come out of React Native, and then we've been, and I say we, and it's mostly Thibaut, been maintaining it ever since. What I tend to work on more is Ignite, which is our React Native boilerplate, and Reactatron, which I mentioned earlier. So the title of my talk, Resolving the Great State Debate. So a little bit of history. When React came out, there was this, I saw React and I thought this is really cool, but what about how do you manage state? And they said, well, just use Flux, well, this pattern, and showed a diagram, and it had like arrows going everywhere and bubbles everywhere, and I got completely lost. And then there were a few libraries that kind of came out to try to implement this Flux pattern. One was called Reflux. I think that one didn't make it just because of the name, maybe. And then Redux came out. It was actually pretty awesome. Like, Redux was really cool when it came out, and but more recently, I'm going to quote Yanni Evacalio. He says, just got home from the React Thought Leader meeting. Bad news, we apparently all hate Redux now, so please start rewriting your app as soon as convenient. Thanks. Now, this was prior to hooks. So he says, we couldn't agree on what to replace it with, so just use set state until further notice. So what about Redux? Redux is the elephant in the room. Redux is probably 80%. Raise your hand if you use Redux right now. Yeah, that's a lot of people. Okay, I'm talking to you. So we were Redux users as well. And we started using React Native in 2015, which it came out in 2015. We were React Native newbies. We had been doing native app development prior to that. So Redux to us was awesome. That was the way to do it. We built a lot of apps using Redux, and it was great. There are some problems with Redux. You may agree with some of these, you may not. Learning curve, there are a lot of new terms. What's a reducer? What is dispatch? What are action creators? Thunks, sagas. It's like people are just making up words. And then we had to know what those meant. But lots of boilerplate, right? That was another piece of this. It is better now, but at the time you were touching a lot of files. To make any sort of change, you had to touch many different files. Dan Abramov does not like it when people say this because it's not totally true anymore, but that was our experience. The flux pattern itself is kind of hard to wrap your mind around. Redux doesn't come out of the box with a way to handle side effects, asynchronous kind of flows and things like that. So do you use Redux Thunk? That's kind of the most popular one. But then Redux Sagas has a little more power. It's using generators and some cool stuff. But the middleware itself can become bloated, and that's, again, another concept you have to learn. But I think one of the biggest problems with Redux is, and I think a lot of people do think this is a problem, is that the problem isn't necessarily with Redux. It's that it's how teams use it. It's that there's like many different ways that people use Redux, and these are just some quotes of people that I've heard say things about Redux and criticisms of it. So we started looking for something better, and then hooks and context came out, and we thought, okay, this is cool. Like there's something here. There's obviously the core team really cares about this, and they came out with context, which allows you to kind of sort of distribute your application state throughout your app, and you've got hooks to make clean up everything. So the question is, do hooks replace Redux? Well, hooks really were designed to replace class components first. So you have useState that replaces this.state, this.setState. You have useEffect, which is sort of your lifecycle methods, component, did mount, etc. There are some hooks that can be used for application state, use reducer, use context again, so that you can pass around different values. And there are some performance implications with doing that. But you can if you're careful and you're disciplined. But this sounds a little bit familiar. So I swear this is the last Yanni quote that I'll do. I don't know who out there needs to hear this, but if you are replacing Redux with just context without carefully considering your domain model and where it should live in the React tree, you've just invented a worse Redux. So you can do it with some discipline, but this is my opinion, this was our opinion, was that they don't really replace Redux. There are some missing pieces, and that's where MobX and MobX state tree come in. You may be like, okay, well, what's MobX? Well, I'm going to tell you. Don't worry. So Jay is here. That's Jay and me in front of the conference center. Having never used Redux, I hate it. Having never used MobX, I love it. And upon seeing the slide, having read this slide, I love it. Thanks, Jay. That's all that slide was. Okay. So what is MobX? Well, when I'm talking about MobX, I'm actually talking about the MobX trifecta: MobX, MobX-React, and MobX state tree. So I will differentiate between them, but as you'll see, they all work together to help give us the state management that we're looking for. MobX, it provides the underlying functions to build your application state and manage it. It's the engine. It's the thing that basically you don't really see, but when you press on the gas pedal, it makes everything go. Incidentally, my Jeep Wrangler just started running rough, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to replace the engine. I am considering MobX because it's pretty cool. Okay, so Michel Westray, who created MobX State Tree, says, MobX State Tree is like React, but for data. How I like to think about MobX State Tree is that MST makes MobX a bit more like Redux in the good ways. So MobX comes, and it's really kind of free-form. It doesn't have a lot of opinions, gives you a lot of power, but not a lot of direction. MobX State Tree gives you some patterns to follow. It's opinionated. It says this is how you define a model. This is how you interact with other models, and this is how you might consume that. And you'll see examples of this in a bit. MobX-React, I think, is actually the coolest part of this, even though it was probably actually the smallest part, in that it wires up MobX State Tree and MobX to React, and it makes every component, you'll see this in a bit, it makes every component an observer. And this allows for extremely great performance with zero effort. So when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about the MobX trifecta, one cohesive system, MobX, MobX State Tree, and MobX-React. So I'm going to show a bunch of code. And I know it's late, and I know that there's a lot of information in your heads right now. And I'm going to go very quickly, but these slides will be available, and you'll be able to look at them later. But hopefully at the end, you'll have a good sort of sense of the shape of what a MobX State Tree application might look like. So, good. That actually is readable. Good. Accessing state. So I'm going to start with that. Let's say that we have an NBA app. I'm kind of an NBA fan. So there's NBA players, basketball players. And we have a screen that just lists all of the NBA players in the NBA. And maybe we're pulling in the root store and we're checking the status of something, whether we're like fetching the data or something like that. As you can see here, the root store, I'm going to go into this in more detail later, but the root store has properties, and root store.status is a property, and it is observed. You can get the team names, and these are just like, it's an array of data, and you can map through them and grab the names out of the teams. You can fire off actions. I'm going to show you again examples of all this stuff. I just want to set the stage, like this is how you would use it in your view. This is a screen, this is a component. We also have views, which are basically ways to express data that is in the store or the model, but you need to basically manipulate it in some way and do some sort of like computed property. So that's what a view is. You'll see that as well. Okay, so MobX State Tree Model. You start by defining your models. And your models are, in this case, this is a team, so my favorite NBA team, the Portland Trail Blazers. Assume that this is like the model that's kind of showing, all the data that's from that. You get that from MobX State Tree. It gives you a types module that has a model function on it, and you define off of that. These are runtime types. You don't have to use TypeScript for this. TypeScript will infer types from that, which is very cool. But we're just talking about runtime types. So in this case, we have an ID, which is an identifier. And then we have a city, so it's referencing another MobX State Tree model, a city, Portland, and the Trailblazers is the team. We also have just random properties like region, and it's a string, capacity of the arena, and that's a number. You can provide things like enumerations, like what is your current strategy? Are you rebuilding? Are you contending? This year we're contending, hopefully. You can also do stores, and stores are very similar to models. They're actually defined by the model function, but they're used in a slightly different way. They're kind of like the place that originates, like you'll have models in your store. Your store is kind of like your root. In this case, we're actually defining a root store. It can hold other stores. Unlike Redux, you don't just have one global store. You can have multiple stores. Again, you might have properties. In this case, an array of teams and an enumeration of different statuses of that team. Of your app, actually. You can define actions, and actions are the only place that you can manipulate the data. So in MobX State Tree, everything's immutable unless you're in an action, and this is really key. So you can't just mutate your data. It won't get picked up, nothing will happen. But if you fire off an action, and then as you can see here, like set teams, like I got the data from my API, right? And I'm ready to shove it all into the teams property. This set teams is a function that will, or a method that will actually do that. And within that, the way that it is expressed is just self.teams equals teams. So it's very, even though it's an immutable data structure, it looks very simple. This is very cool, and I'm going to show a more complex version of this in a bit, but it comes with a function called flow. And flow allows you to define right out of the box an asynchronous like side effect, such as going out and loading something and then doing something afterward. And this is using a generator function. If you're not familiar with generator functions, just sort of think of this as async away. It's a little more low level, and there's a little more capability here. But essentially what we're doing is we're waiting for our API service to get the teams, and then we're just setting the teams, and above and below we are setting our status. So it reads very like top to bottom. You can also do error handling here. I didn't show that, but you can do error handling as well. Okay, so what does MobX-React look like? More or less, it's two things. It's the observer and the provider context. We'll look at the provider context after a bit, but the observer turns any React component into an observer. So if you haven't done this type of programming before, what an observer does is it looks, and as it's when you render your function, or your function component, it will actually monitor what properties of like a MobX state tree model or store are actually accessed in that component. If those change at any point in like an action, it will re-render that component and that component only that actually includes that property. So you could actually populate many, many different components with a single property, a different property, many properties, many models, and it will only re-render the components within your app that have actually changed. This is the key behind the performance that you get for free right out of the box with MobX-React. And all you have to do that is wrap your component in this observer function, and it's good to go. MobX provider context allows you to use React use context. So this is like a brand new feature in React, and access any store that has been registered using the types.model function. So you can access the root store. In this case, we're grabbing the root store and we're grabbing all of the NBA teams from that, and then we're looping through, we're providing that over to the flat list. If you've done React Native, you've probably used flat list before. And it essentially, we're just grabbing those teams, putting them into data, and iterating through them, passing through all the properties, and this will just behave as you would expect. The flat list will be rendered when the properties that it's consuming change. Side effects. I said that I would talk about a more complex side effect flow here. This is actually a slightly simplified version. I basically just removed sort of the error handling of an actual app that we've written that's actually in the App Store running right now. So this is code that is in production. So think of this warm as just being in that actions kind of definition part of the MobX state tree model. We had a flow, like a user flow, where they would do something that would trigger like, we need permission, okay? So you'd send off this action, and you'd say, I need to do the warmer for this permission type, whatever the permission type might be, maybe accessing photos or something like that. When that happened, it would check. This is just a function that does the checking, and it would wait for that. It's sort of async await again. It would yield, wait for whether we have permission or not. If we have permission, it would skip the warmer entirely and just move on. Okay? Return true. Otherwise, it would navigate, this uses React navigation, to the warmer, and it would sit there and idle using the when function. So this is another piece of MobX state tree. I think that actually comes from MobX. But you can sit there and idle and monitor a property, and when that property changes, then continue on. This is a very natural way to do actually fairly complex flows. So we're waiting for that warmer to become inactive. The warmer might actually say, you need to go into your settings app and change this permission because you didn't give it the first time. We can't ask again, I'm sorry. And then we simply provide do the check again. Did they give us permission? If not, no. If they did, then cool. Let's do whatever we were going to do. Views are sort of like computed, like I said, computed properties. You can take something that you already have, such as we want to sort the teams by name, okay? So self.teams, by the way, you see the word self. That's part of sort of the syntax of MobX state tree. I'm not going to go into it, but instead of using this, you're using self. It's provided. .sort, and just this is like a sorting function. You've probably written this function before. We're just sorting by the team name, or in this case, I guess the team city. And so Portland Trail Blazers would be in wherever the P's go. All right. So React navigation. Why is React navigation in this talk? Because navigation is part of your application state. when you're passing through to React navigation your screen properties, those become part of your application state. If you were to swipe away from it and come back to it, you would want those things to be in place. So very nicely, the React navigation team has provided a MobX state tree integration guide that works very well. I've messed around with it. So the main thing from this is the bottom part here. It says, please note that in this guide, MobX state tree is not used to manage the navigation state itself, just the navigation parameters, or params. So this is sort of a key point here. You store in any store you want, but you can actually create like a navigation store. This is what we do. And you provide a property for each thing. You can just define a model on the fly. Like I need a property of user just for the user screen, like the profile screen. What user am I showing? And you provide that in your navigation store. Same thing with like a team screen. We're keeping our parameters for the team in this store. This is what the React navigation team recommends. And then instead of doing this, where you would navigate to profile screen and maybe pass in a user, instead of doing that, you would set the user, fire off an action, say like in your navigation store, let's set the current user to this user, and then navigate to the profile screen. It'll already be set because the store has been updated, and anything that consumes that store, that screen, will be updated. React navigation hooks is a very cool library. We saw a little bit of that in Satya and Mihaw's talk, lightning talk, but use navigation. And so this is, again, a piece of this where you can navigate to somewhere, and if you need to set your properties, again, set them on your navigation store. If you were in the lightning talk, you know that the React Navigation 5.0 will have a new component-centric API. So this is something that I'm going to have to look in more detail at and see how this impacts. My first impression, and after talking to Brent, is that it's going to make things easier, actually. So you may be wondering, like, okay, so all right, Jamon, you've talked about all these, this great application state system that you use at Infinite Red, but I've heard, GraphQL is like the latest and greatest thing. Maybe you should be using that instead. So you can use Apollo with MobX State Tree. You can use other systems, but there is an experimental MobX State Tree GraphQL library, MST GQL, and what it does is it actually hooks up your MST, or it generates MST models, like code generation, from a GraphQL schema. Remember when we were defining our models, what we were doing was we were defining essentially like a schema, right? And so why not take the source of truth, which is your GraphQL, and just generate your MobX State Tree models from that? So I will be giving a talk in about a month in Florida at Ancient City Ruby, Rails, and React with Morgan Locko, who works for me. She knows GraphQL better than I do, so that's going to be a cool coordination between us. We're going to show how you can use Ruby GraphQL to define your schemas and then generate all the way through your React Native app and have everything end-to-end generated for you. That's going to be in Jacksonville Beach, Florida, October 3rd and 4th. So let's mix all of this together. We've talked about the individual pieces. You have sort of an idea of what MobX State Tree looks like, what MobX-React does, what hooks are doing, where you use context, but let's see it all in one component. So here's the component. This is using all of those things, and we're going to jump through it one by one. Now, this is a little bit contrived because obviously your render method here is just kind of wrapping another component in a view. That's all the space I had, so that's what you get. I recommend using hooks for local state. If you don't need it anywhere outside of your component, use a hook. That's what they're really good for, and that's what you should use. So in this case, we are providing a current player. Let's say that you're selecting a player on a list of different NBA players, and that really doesn't need to be propagated elsewhere in the app. This is only a specific thing for this screen, this player's screen that we're looking at. You want to use context for accessing your MobX state tree stores. So remember how I said context, there are some gotchas with performance. Those kind of go away when all you're passing around is your store. And so I do recommend using context, react.useContext. You pass in the MobX provider context. You get that directly from MobX-React, so you're not having to define anything. It's just you're pulling that in. And then you just access the store that you want from there as a property. And then from that, you can then grab properties on that store, and this is MobX state tree, and use those. And then MobX-React then wraps the whole component in and makes it an observer, and this allows you to monitor where those pieces that you're pulling out of the MobX state tree store are being used, and the specific properties that are actually being used, and then only re-render the component when that property changes. For navigation, we do recommend using React. This is what we use, React navigation. We recommend using the React navigation hooks because it cleans up your API and use it in the way that they recommend in the documentation for integrating with MobX state tree. So as you can see here, we've gone through pretty much all the code here, and it is all of those things that we just talked about in one basically cohesive way to use them. This is that same thing we just looked at a little bit ago, and if you want to use, if you have some side effects, which you almost certainly do, use MobX state tree and the flow command. This comes, just like you see right here, right from MobX state tree. You don't need another library. You don't need any other terms. It's just a flow and generator functions, which are actually pretty simple. You can more or less use the same thing that you would use async await for. We already include all of these things, with one caveat, in Ignite Browser. So what is Ignite Browser? Ignite is a CLI that generates a React Native app from a boilerplate. The boilerplate we currently recommend is Ignite Browser. This comes with MobX state tree, MobX-React, MobX, and React navigation. Now, we're currently working on upgrading Ignite Browser to the latest and greatest, which does include some of these concepts that I've talked about today, pretty much all of them. So keep an eye on it for that. Ignite Browser is probably one of the most popular React Native boilerplates out there. You may have used either Andros, which was the first one, or Browser. So definitely go check out that repo. You'll get all of this stuff kind of pre-made, and if you use this to create a new app, what we've heard from other people and what our experience has been is that it fast forwards you through basically the first 2 to 4 weeks of your project. It's pretty awesome. So let me talk about this, React NavX. So there sort of comes a time when you are exploring, like you want to start by having maximum flexibility. When we started using React Native, we mixed and matched different pieces and different clients. We tried this, we evaluated how it went. We tried that, we evaluated how it went. And we weren't always satisfied with the results. And so we kept moving. This included a switch from Redux to MobX and MobX state tree. But what we've noticed over the last year is that we've really started to see a pattern emerging. So what I'm working on right now is an experimental runtime library that brings all these concepts together into one library. Now, it's not my goal to hide any of this stuff behind the API. You still know that you're using React navigation. You still know you're using MobX state tree and MobX-React. These are all very, very much first-class concepts within React NavX. But it provides sort of the glue code and the patterns that you would need to build an app using all of these pieces. and it removes about 500 lines currently of code, which is just glue code, from your app, perhaps more in the future. This is all subject to change. If you're watching this online later, it probably has changed. So go look at the documentation. If it says deprecated, then it was a dumb idea and I decided not to do it. Use root store, use nav store, use store, just any store. It includes MobX, MobX state tree, MobX-React as dependencies. It includes React navigation and hooks as dependencies. It has state persistence built in, so if you kill the app, you swipe it off on the simulator or your device, and you restart the app, hopefully, if React NavX does its job properly, it will come back exactly in the same state that it was before. And it has Reactatron support built in. And I think there's some really cool stuff that we can do with Reactatron when we know that we're using a React NavX supported app. Because if we know that our React navigation is being managed by MobX state tree, and if we know exactly how all these pieces are fitting together, we can provide some very cool functionality, such as navigate to this screen. And just in Reactatron, which is a desktop app that runs alongside of your simulator, hit that button, and it just goes there. By the way, my 14-year-old son, Cedric, said that I had to tell everybody that it was his idea to come up with the name React NavX. I delivered, Cedric. It just means navigation and MobX together. By the way, I named it React NavX because there's a high likelihood that we could use this on the web as well. So what would it look like, maybe? So in your main entry file, let's say your app.js, you could just import NavX from React NavX and provide your stores, which you've defined already, and you provide it with your root screen, which might be some sort of stack navigator, or maybe it's just a screen if you only have one screen. But basically, this is your root of your app, and then it handles wiring everything up for you. I actually already have this working on a proof of concept app that I'm working on. With the new React Navigation API, with the component-driven one, maybe it's not a screen property, and maybe it's like children inside of the NavX component, but this is an idea. React NavX, the idea behind this is that we would also expose all of the important features that you would need in order to access your state from any screen, such as use store, use navigation, observer, anything, it's pulling in pieces from all different places, flow. All those things are accessible through React NavX. You can still always bring them in directly from their parent library, but this would just be a shortcut. And then you would just use them as you would expect. You're maybe using hooks, which is outside of React NavX, doesn't need to come through it, or use navigation directly from it. So it is very new. Expect everything to be broken. It is currently broken. But you can go take a look at the repo at github.com/infinitered/reactnavx. Now, even if React NavX isn't the way to go, jury's still out a little bit, I feel pretty confident in these patterns because we've been using them at Infinite Red for over a year. These are pretty well-tested things. MobX is an incredibly well-engineered system. MobX state tree makes everything, gives you a pattern to follow, and MobX-React gives you that performance for free that you want. So I don't have much more time, so I'm going to just say I'm going to give you all the links. Write them down really quick. No, that's okay. I'll put the slides up. So all the links I talked about, Infinite Red, you can go to infinite.red to see our website. You can go to our community Slack, community.infinite.red. That is a Slack team where there are thousands of React Native engineers, probably some of you, interacting all the time, including many of my engineers. And you can also check out Chain React, which I talked about a little bit earlier. My Twitter handle, Jamon Holmgren, jamonholmgren.com. Thank you very much.